today we're talking about ideas about evolution, the idea of race, subspecies ideas, and we will end talking about racism and the biological consequences of racism. So at the end of the Muckle, Gonzalez, and Camp chapter, wrapping up our human biological evolution, they spend a couple of paragraphs, maybe even a couple of pages, you might say, on the idea of race as a biological category. And they assert that it has no biological validity as a categorization of human beings, which is true. But in my opinion, they make that assertion a little too quickly, in the sense that they could go a bit more into the evidence. Now, maybe we don't need them to go into the evidence because it's complicated, but I want to spend some time going more into depth, given that this is our last biological anthropology unit class, and going in a little more into depth about the biological evidence for why people, science, not just anthropologists, have made this assertion about race and racial categories. But I want to start back with the whole idea of evolution. Ever since the idea of evolution came out, people have been trying to use it to justify or to explain the categorizations of race that actually existed before evolution, but are not that old, as we'll find out. But people have always tried to harness the ideas of evolution to emerging ideas about racial categorization, and basically to justify the racist structure of society that was in place at the time these ideas emerged. And so whenever we talk about evolution, we actually have to think about this history and how the attempts that people made to link it to race, because for many people, they believe that studying evolution will give them insights into the true categorizations of race. To do this, I want to go back to a slide that we saw when we were thinking about the idea of evolution as it emerged in the 19th, well, the idea of evolution emerged before the 19th century, but as it was kind of consolidated under Darwin and the mechanism of natural selection, that the great chain of being, this idea that there was perfection and ascent between the imperfect animals leading up to the perfect man. I'm going to be using the term man here as a relic of the 19th century, because there was a whole sexist part of this thing going on too, which we'll talk about a bit more in the next section on archaeology. So I'm just putting it in there because those were the terms of the time, and that's what they were talking about. So we have this idea about evolution being a progressive joining links on an ascending great chain of being. And then in the second class of this course, I also talked about what people thought about others in terms of this ascendancy from the primitive or the savagery through barbarism to the civilized. And we talk about Lewis Henry Morgan and his book, Ancient Society, or researchers in the progress of people from primitive through barbarism to civilization, or something like that. And if you join these two ideas together, which is what people started to do, and this one is called, so there's kind of a unilinear theory of biological evolution, which got joined to a unilinear theory of social evolution. if you put these two things together, you have an incorrect evolutionary idea combined with some incorrect ethnocentric hierarchies, and you get what has been called scientific racism, or the idea that there is an ascendancy from the animal forms through man, and then you have primitive man who then ascends into civilized man. Again, as I said, I'm using the term man because it's a relic of its time, because there is both a racist element and a sexist element to this explanation. Now, I've put the term scientific in quotes because there is actually nothing scientific about this scheme. It's an incorrect scheme in terms of its ideas about evolution, and that's one of the reasons I was concerned with saying goodbye to the great chain of being. And it's also incorrect in its ideas about everyone being on a ladder from savage to barbaric to civilized. I would also say that although this scheme justified some very bad things that people did in the world, it probably wasn't a causal scheme. That is to say, the structure of society had already been put in place by the time these ideas were joined together in what is called scientific racism. Darwin, for example, although he was suspicious of ideas about classifications of race, he very much believed, especially in his book, The Descent of Man, that there was a smaller gap between what he called the man of the primitive man and the animal than there was between primitive man and the civilized. And it was a pretty awful assertion to make, but it was something that a lot of people believed. Now, if you remember, Darwin shared his ideas about natural selection with Alfred Russell Wallace, but Alfred Russell Wallace kind of disappears from the scientific account of how evolution occurs. And I talked about how, well, Darwin had been researching it more, and he wrote better books and longer books, and he had more analysis. But one of the reasons that Alfred Russell Wallace disappeared is because Wallace, unlike Darwin, was very familiar with people who lived in the tropics and were designated by these terms. And he knew that they were a lot smarter and capable than people like Darwin knew, because Darwin spent most of his time in London. And so Wallace couldn't reconcile this scheme, and so he proposed instead that God had created the brains of all people. And for this idea, he was kind of banished from the evolutionary textbooks because it was seen as, a creationist idea. But what he was really trying to do was reconcile the fact that he knew that the people who were being called primitive or savage were in fact as intelligent and capable as the civilized. But we get this very, like I said, a very toxic combination of ideas that are joined together in the late 19th century. And so this is also the time that anthropology is being born and coming about. So we talked about in the third class, I think, that anthropology is born during a time of European colonialism and the expansion of European and North American empires throughout the world. And so it comes in at a time when the questions being asked and when academic disciplines are forming are, well, how do we explain how people are different? Are all peoples equally human? And the ideas of this hierarchy of peoples, which we saw from Lewis Henry Morgan and others, these ideas were used to justify the conquest and subordination that had in many cases already taken place or was taking place at the time. And the classification schemes that we still use today were for the most part developed during from about 1500 up through 1900. So I think Cass, you asked, where did these classification schemes come from? They were, one of the first was given to us by our good friend Linnaeus, who classified, we'll talk about his classifications later. He originally had six categorizations, which included Homo monstruosus and Homo ferus, which were wild man and monstrous man. But he also came up with the 4 color schemes that were still in use for a long time: yellow, red, black, and white, and affixed those to various names for groups. We will talk more about the cultural designation that led us to these racial categories, but that's where they came from, is the era, the epoch of European and North American colonialism. And so, like I said, some of these, many of the classification schemes, we talked about how Linnaeus was actually a creationist. He didn't know about evolution, but from the time that evolution and natural selection and survival of the fittest came into a kind of unity, those ideas were used then to justify the inequalities and promote what is now called scientific racism. So that's how anthropology comes into the world and is born as an academic discipline, is swimming in the middle of all this stuff. And as we saw, some anthropologists basically provided ammunition and support for this idea. But eventually, based on field work and measurings and doing a whole bunch of data and ideas, anthropologists would eventually argue that race is not determining of behavior, that it doesn't influence our abilities to, or it doesn't determine what kind of language we're going to speak, or what kind of ideas we're going to have, or what kind of behavior we're going to enact, that is learned from a very early age, so it becomes very embodied in us, but it is a learned behavior. Anthropologists would also start to talk, would also say that it doesn't, the racial categorizations that were in place, these sort of color schemes that grouped vast numbers of people together, were not a good way to describe how different societies, even on the same continent, or people of the, in the same racial category, would have very different, extremely different ideas about culture. And then eventually, the kind of biggest argument is that those classifications themselves were not an accurate way to describe the biological differences that were observed in the human populations. And I think that for the most part in our society, we know this one, that race doesn't determine behavior, and we know that race is not a good way to describe cultural difference. But the understanding of why it is that anthropologists and other scientists believe that our racial classifications are not a good way to categorize or describe biological difference is a little bit more difficult to understand. So we'll be spending a little more time on that. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the idea of the species and the idea of the subspecies. So just to be clear, as we've learned in the spread of Homo sapiens all over the habitable world and the disappearance of other bipedals, all humans for the last 30,000 years, probably longer, can all interbreed together and produce viable interbreeding offspring. So obviously, the reproductive stuff has to be at the right age and in place, but as one of my old professors used to put it, if you're thinking about the largest Nordics and the smallest, yes, they can get together and produce viable interbreeding offspring. And one of the things that we know this is true is because whenever human groups come into contact, they do that with each other. They may say they don't like each other. They may do bad things to each other. They may fight each other, but they also interbreed with each other. They're constantly testing the hypothesis of the species, and it's constantly being proved correct that we're able to interbreed with each other. So whenever we would think about race, and even as in biology, the idea of race to describe a sub-level has kind of gone out of favor because, in fact, it's a difficult thing to do, especially as our species boundaries, as we talked about in the last class, we've realized they're not as solid as we thought. But if we were to designate race, it wouldn't obviously be at the species level, it would be somewhere below that, at the level of a subspecies. And when it comes to subspecies, we know a couple things, is that Homo sapiens are the kind of, some people have called us, like I said in the last class, a relict species, because we once had a much wider range of variation within the Homo category. And we had different, more biological difference of people who were interacting with each other. And so we're kind of what is left over from that wider range of variation. And so some people, and I'm underlining here the word perhaps, some people say that if the last true races or subspecies of Homo would have been the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So we talked about in the last class how we do know now that there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and Denisovans and the emergent Homo sapiens, and we know that because there's evidence of genetic admixture in contemporary humans. However, the Neanderthals and Denisovans were pretty different to the extent that a lot of people considered them and still consider them to be a separate species. That is to say, yeah, we kind of recognize them if they showed up here, even if they dressed in a business suit, there was a picture of one in a business suit in your textbook, but they would look pretty remarkably different, to the extent that, like I said, a lot of people thought that there wasn't any interbreeding. So that may mark the boundaries of the last time that there was actually a distinctive subspecies of Homo within our own groups. Now the question is, when we talk about a subspecies, is there enough biological difference within the human species, within this species, to classify human beings into groups? And on that question, I actually would like to clarify something that in some ways Muckle and Gonzalez and Camp kind of go back and forth on, which is that there are physical differences within the human population, within our contemporary species. And we'd be stupid if we didn't say, oh yes, actually we could use all kinds of differences in order to classify people into groups. I'll talk about some of those differences that we could use. So yes, people vary, people look different, they have different biological characteristics, but in order to come up with a subspecies, you would have to have a consistency or a concordance between some of these traits, so that people of a certain skin color would also come with certain kinds of other characteristics. So you'd have to have some patterns in which you could then group people into what we call races. And on that question, the answer is a very clear no. That our biological variation is actually much more complex and does not sort out into these or other proposed racial categorizations. And I guess I'll just say that's been one of the reasons that we kind of know that the race idea doesn't work, is because some people want to sort it into 4 groups, some people want to sort us into 5, some people say there's 7, some people said there were 34, some people 45. So, you know, you get different groupings when people do different kinds of things. So, again, no one is saying that people are all the same. We're pretty the same. We're a very homogeneous species. We actually have a lot less genetic variation than some other species like penguins, but we're not completely the same. There's definitely biological variation, and if we wanted to, we could try and sort people into groups. So I want to talk about go into some of the human biological variation that varies across populations of human beings. And I'm dividing that into this roughly using the various scientific stuff you can see and stuff you can't see. So stuff we can observe and stuff that we have to get under our skin to observe, or we have to use microscopes to see. So stuff you can see, as we all know, people vary according to their color of their skin. People also vary according to hair color, hair form, hair texture, curly, straight. Hair is one of the first things or second things that people look at when they're trying to figure out who people are. Right? We also know that eye color varies. Eye shape, eye form varies among population, noses and lips, thin, wide. Something that we don't usually think about, but among populations that have relatively unvarying hair color, they sometimes use this to talk about people, but we usually don't look at it that much. I'm sure people's ears, how they vary and how they might hang in different ways, and talk about things. We can talk about different head forms, and we can talk about tall, short, stocky. So people biologically vary in all kinds of different ways. We sometimes concentrate on only a couple of them to try and figure out how to sort people, but we could use a whole bunch of them. We have some stereotypes about where these things fall in terms of skin color and different shapes. We'll talk about those in a second. Stuff you can't see. Well, you can see fingerprints, but you have to get up close and ink them out, really. So fingerprints are something that people vary along. Blood types, A, B, O, and combinations. Genetics, genetic variation, how much genetic diversity that you have and how those can be grouped together. Something we're finding out more about these days and you have to take care of is your gut bacteria and how that's That varies from population to population. Malaria resistance, whether you have the heterozygous trait, which is the sickle cell trait, or there are some other forms, but that's another way in which humans biologically vary. And we talked a little bit about lactose digestion, that's a biological variation, being able to process lactose to adulthood is something that varies among human populations. So all of these variations are interesting, sometimes important, sometimes not. But what is very clear is, although some of these start to cluster in different geographical areas of the world, they don't cluster in a way in which you can say, aha, all the people of a certain skin type or build are also going to have the same kind of gut bacteria. So let's look at a couple of different ways that people vary. We talked about lactose. So on the one hand, you have very light-skinned Northern Europeans up there, but you also have very dark-skinned West Africans and very dark-skinned Southern Africans and medium-skinned Saudi Arabians and parts of India, and then not in Asia. And so if you tried to group this up by skin color and race, you would not get the same groupings. So you could get together and you could designate the race of the lactose tolerant, but they'd look completely different in terms of skin colors and all those other things that we usually use to talk about race. Some people in the United States believe that sickle cell trait corresponds to race. And that has to do with the African slave trade, which basically brought people from West Africa to the United States. And so the people oftentimes that we see with sickle cell were from these areas. However, sickle cell arises anywhere there is malaria. And so there's some high sickle cell concentrations in northern India, again in Saudi Arabia, and even in places like Sicily and Greece. And so it's one of those hidden things where sometimes there are some recessive sickle cell traits among Greek populations that you have to watch out for. So although we sometimes think sickle cell in this country, we think of it as a race-linked trait, it actually, as lactose tolerance, does not depend upon skin color and would group us up in a very different way. We can do blood types. So this is something that, you can measure the percent of the population that has A, B, or O, and that's going to group up in different parts of the world. And you would get, again, different kinds of skin colors put together and different kinds of hair and noses and eyes together with different kinds of blood types. We could also measure genetic diversity, and this is a quote from an article that I sometimes assign about, it's where I get the quote about Homo sapiens being a relict species. If you look at human evolution, most of it occurs in southern Africa. And so the greatest genetic diversity is actually among the populations of southern Africa. And the populations that are spread across Eurasia and the Americas are actually only a subset of the greater genetic diversity that is still present in southern Africa. If all of these people went away, we would still be able to reconstruct the entire genetic diversity of human beings from the existing populations in South Africa. So southwestern Africa, sorry, not the country of, getting close. So what this all means is that there is a difference between concordance or covariation as against the idea of clinal or independent variation. So let me explain those terms. The term clinal means gradual variation. So, as Michael Gonzalez Camp put it, most human variation is continuous. There is no, if we lined up all the people of the world by skin color, darkest to lightest, there's no place that you can draw a line and say, aha, on one side are these people. You can draw lots of different lines, but it's going to be a gradual variation all the way across. It's a complete clinal variation in terms of skin color. And that applies to most human traits, which gradually vary across often a geographic range. But certainly if you line everybody up according to them, you see gradual variation. Other features are very independently, so they combine and recombine in different ways. And some of the stereotypes that we have in the United States in this country about certain skin colors going together with certain nose shapes and certain hair texture forms are based upon the sample of people who have been brought or shown up in this country. So if you look within Africa, for example, you will see populations with very thin noses and very thin lips. And if you look in India, you will see populations with very dark skin and very straight hair. So and actually, if you look in Australia, you can see some people with very dark skin and blonde or reddish curly hair as well. So these features, as we know from Mendel, can be combined and recombined in different ways. They don't come together as a package. And if we were to classify people and say, okay, I'm going to lump all the people of the lactose tolerant together, then you'd get an entirely different group than if you lumped all the people of the malaria resistant together. So all of the times that people have tried to place biologically people into these groups, I mean, you can make groups, but they don't correspond to each other. And it would, in the end, be so many that it would become almost completely meaningless. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it isn't important to understand and to explain the biological differences that we see in the human population. What accounts for these differences? Well, as we saw, there are several mechanisms of evolution. One of them is natural selection, which helps to explain the sickle cell trait that provides resistance to malaria. So in areas where agriculture and malaria and certain kinds of irrigation have formed and malarial mosquitoes emerged, there is a recessive trait that if you happen to be heterozygous for, you are resistant to malaria. Unfortunately, it's a very dangerous trait because if you're homozygous, if you get two recessives, it can make you very sick and you can die. So it arises as an adaptive function in a malaria zone, but it's extremely maladaptive in a non-malaria zone. And then, so it's an example of how evolution works sometimes in kind of cruel ways that, yeah, we have an adaptive trait, but if the environment changes, it's extremely maladaptive, and we have to be careful to treat it if we can where it arises. Lactose tolerance, perhaps it's less, is also an adaptive and I guess maladaptive trait if you don't have it and you're being forced to drink all this milk and eat cheese. It's kind of mean, but it's something that arises as a function of natural selection. If your ancestors were cattle herders and depended on milk and cheese, it's arisen that way. So that's one way that some of these traits developed is because of natural selection. Sexual selection also sometimes some people have thought that some of our beauty traits, and if you look in the want ads for people looking for each other, that's one of the things that they'll try to talk about is eyes and hair and skin. And so it is possible that sexual selection has played a role in when people are seeking mates and thinking about what kinds of things they are considered attractive. I've put in might because sexual selection is always a very tricky thing. It works, but it's over time, it doesn't seem to explain as much as some people like it to. There's also a lot of stuff that is simply random. We talked about gene flow, about people going off into different populations. If you look at fingerprints, for example, you can group people up by the number of whorls and swirls and hills and stuff that they have in different populations, and they'll actually also they'll be different. But again, if you put them together with other traits, they don't match up to other things, and they seem to be pretty much random. They don't seem to, your particular type of fingerprint doesn't seem to have much natural selection stuff. And then the other thing we should know is that simple Mendelian genetics doesn't explain what's going on in most human traits. Most traits are being expressed in polygenic form. So let's go back to the classic, one of the classic designations of how race was classified is according to skin color. This is the skin color distribution as it may have been in the year 1492, or with populations that are indigenous to these areas. And what we see is, like in the human species in general, a clinal distribution, or a slow range of variation based upon geography. So the reason I'm using this as an example is because this is before the time of transoceanic travel and people moving across the oceans on ships. People were always moving around. They were walking and migrating and being bipedal and trading with each other and being human. And as they walked into different places, they needed to absorb in the northern latitudes more vitamin D. And so there was probably what we call a depigmentation when you get out of the southern tropical latitudes into the north. And the depigmentation happened perhaps in different genetic ways in Asia and in Europe. But if you took a walk from sort of Northern Europe all the way down to the tropics, although some of we've drawn in lines here according to skin color variation, there's no place along this line at which you would say, aha, I've crossed from the village of the whites into the village of the blacks, because it would be a continuous line of variation, sort of light to dark all the way from the tropics up to the north. And you'd have a similar continuous variation across Eurasia and within the Americas as well, probably mostly based on exposure to the sun. Now, how did we get from this continuous variation into this idea of that people come in blocks? Well, as we talked about, this happened in the era in which certain people were put into chains and on boats and taken into the Americas, and others were colonized, and others were coming in to take over people's land and property, or fleeing religious persecution. And basically this put together different types of people that would not necessarily have encountered each other if you, again, took that walk between places. And so, again, the ideas of race and racial classification basically arose as a part of what was going on in the Americas. There different classification schemes arose in what is called Latin America and the United States. And later on in the course, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about the different cultural classification schemes for race, but it had a lot to do with organizing labor and who was supposed to work for whom and keeping people in place in a new environment where people were being brought together from different parts of the world. At the time, a lot of the other variation in human forms were really not present as much in the Americas. And so in the United States, for example, our racial categories get very confusing when we look at people from places that were not necessarily part of the colonial encounter. We don't know we don't have a category for people, and the variation that happens, for example, within the South Asian, within India, which can range from very dark to very light skin. And we're kind of, in the United States, we don't usually know what box we're supposed to do with people, because our racial classification systems came from this from this encounter and continue to structure our lives.